Greetings everybody, Dragon here, and since I did a comparison between the first season of Iron Fist and the comics, I wanted to do another for the second season of the show. Now, for season 2 of Iron Fist, its story is mainly based on a subplot for the entire first volume of the first Iron Fist comic line, released back in 1975. As I said in my previous video making the comparison between the first season and the comics, in Marvel Premiere, the story ended with the kidnapping of Colleen Wing by a character named Master Khan. During the Iron Fist series, Davos kind of remained in the background for most of the story, but he had a clear connection to Danny and Kunlun since his first appearance in Iron Fist issue 1 published back in 1975. At first it wasn't clear what he wanted. It wasn't until issue 13 that we learn about his wish for revenge against Danny's father Wendell and Kunlun. But it isn't until issue 14 of the same series that we learn about his character's mysterious ability to drain energy from Danny. After, Davos ambushes Danny one more time in issue 15 of Iron Fist, which also was the last issue of this volume, seemingly leaving the story in a cliffhanger. In reality, and for whatever reason, the actual end of the story of Davos happens in the comic series titled Marvel Team Up in its issue 63 and 64. In here we find out how Davos is the son of Liu Kang, aka the Thunderer, and Danny's Kung Fu master. Also how according to Davos it was the Thunderer, Wendell, and UT that drove him out of Kunlun before Danny was born. What actually happened was that Wendell was Davos' opponent in the competition for the Iron Fist. He was beaten by Wendell, but because Davos refused to yield after being badly hurt, the adopted father of Wendell and the leader of Kunlun at the time decided to stop the fight and declare Wendell the victor, mainly so Davos wouldn't die because of his pride. Upset by this, Davos decides to ignore the verdict, as well as some harsh words from his father the Thunderer, and decides to face Shao Lao so he could try to get the Iron Fist for himself. But since he lacked the discipline to actually defeat the dragon, he ends up with half the mark of the Iron Fist and none of the power. Later, after his treachery is discovered, he is banished from Kunlun and never heard from again. That is until Davos finds out about Danny being the current Iron Fist, thing that prompted him to hunt Danny down, to take revenge, and the power he thought he deserved. This ultimately leads to a confrontation between Danny and Davos, in which Danny momentarily loses the power of the Iron Fist just to gain it back in one final battle against Davos, with the outcome being the supposed death of Davos, also known as the Steel Serpent. Side note here, in the end of this story, Spider-Man aka Peter Parker was heavily involved and helped Danny recover his power. Just a quick interesting fact for you. Now, the show basically takes the subplot from the entire first volume of Iron Fist and makes it its main plot. It basically has Davos and Joy working against Danny. Joy wants revenge on Danny for lying, and Davos wants to steal the power of the Iron Fist. There is also a subplot about Danny being addicted to the Iron Fist for whatever reason, and the final twist of Colleen becoming the new Iron Fist / being related to a previous Iron Fist. The first thing you probably notice is how they completely changed the dynamic between Danny and Davos. As in the original, besides his connection with Wendell, Davos didn't have much of a relationship with Danny to begin with. He does team up with Joy, but not in the same degree as in the show. Also, in comics, Davos didn't have this idea of becoming the protector of New York. He simply was power hungry and thought he deserved the Iron Fist. In here, his motivation is basically the same, but disguised as a corrupted, righteous sense of duty. Just, to me, seemed a bit overcomplicated. Joy's role is a bit better, but also worse, because in the original, Joy was more blind to the actual context that surrounded her father's death. In this version, Joy is just spiteful for spite's sake. It simply wasn't the best motivation she could have had, since it just made her seem like a child throwing a tantrum, rather than her actually grieving for her father. In the original, the fact that she was blind to details surrounding Harold's death, mainly how it happened because of his own actions, and how she didn't know who the Iron Fist really was, made her goal to kill Danny a bit more understandable. In here, even if she doesn't know the full context, she did saw Harold for what he truly was. And yes, I know when you're close to someone you tend to make excuses for their bad behavior, but in this scenario she really couldn't make an excuse for him. Even The whole ludicrous idea of it happening because of Danny, and that's the reason why she did this, basically makes no sense, as she knows for a fact that Danny was just as in the dark as she was. There could be an argument for him lying, but again, it's not like Harold didn't like her, and that was before they both knew Danny was alive. Basically, this whole change seems pretty mediocre, and it just suffers from the same ailments of the first season, just an overly convoluted story. As for Davos' side of the story, I think it was fine, but I still don't understand why they didn't simply keep it more comic book accurate. The whole friend turned enemy wasn't bad, but I think the mysterious stranger that has connections to Danny he himself isn't aware of was just better. Then there's the whole Danny being addicted to his power, which I just don't understand at all. Probably the worst idea for this type of character. I say this because since Danny only acquired the Iron Fist for his revenge, he was never particularly attached to it. The first time he lost his power, he wanted it back because the alternative was letting a psychopath have it, and that was around the same for the other times he lost it in comics. Other stories that involve him losing his power and wanting it back are more based on the mystery of why he's losing his powers to begin with, rather than him wanting it back, like just for wanting it back. Even in this iteration, it was very clear that Danny didn't exactly want this power, so it just baffles me that they decided to make him addicted to it. My main guess is that they just wanted any reason for the Iron Fist to go to Colleen, but as something that makes sense for Danny, it simply didn't. Finally, there is the Colleen having the Iron Fist. This was a completely original addition for the show and has never happened in comics. Don't get me wrong, there is a character that does get the Iron Fist after Danny, which in my opinion would have been better than this, but this just seemed like it was done for the wrong reasons. I don't want to get too deep into it in this video, but if you aren't aware of this, the character of Danny Rand has been accused of appropriating a culture in the past. By that I mean in the last 10 years. Which, if you ever pick an Iron Fist comic in your life, you will know how completely baseless and stupid that idea is. But I digress. What I think happened was that maybe there was a bit of an outrage and Netflix wanted to get ahead of the curve, so they made this story in which an Asian character will get the power simply to avoid further outrage. But that's just a well-educated guess at this point. Worst part about this change is that first, there is already a 67 Iron Fist named Pei, which was introduced in the series of Iron Fist the Living Weapon released back in 2014. And second, that in comics it was established how if there were more than one Iron Fist alive at the same time, they could share the power. So there was really no reason why Danny had to give up the Iron Fist or give it to Colleen of all people. Before I continue, I just wanted to quickly mention some other interesting facts about Pei. First one being how she is the first and only Iron Fist that didn't fight Shao Lao to gain the power. And later, after she lost it, she actually manages to regain it by showing the Mother of all Dragons how compassionate she is. Another thing is how she was the youngest Iron Fist to date. And lastly, how she's basically the adopted daughter of Danny, which in general would be more interesting than what they ended up doing. The last thing I wanted to point out was the whole ritual to pass the Iron Fist, because it just doesn't make sense to me. Why would Kunlun have or develop a method of gaining the Iron Fist without just facing the dragon? The whole point is to earn the power, and although it wasn't established in the show, Shao Lao eventually is reborn, so it's not like they couldn't just wait if Kunlun needed another protector. That, by the way, Kunlun needing a protector is still a dumb change from the comics. I guess they thought this made more sense than just Davos being able to acquire it through an incomplete marking on his chest, but still, it just seems too complicated in my opinion. Now for the characters. To start with, and as I mentioned before, Danny in comics was never addicted to the Iron Fist. Besides that, there's not much more to mention here. At least nothing I haven't mentioned already in my previous video. Well, as an interesting fact, I guess, when Danny had to take over Matt Murdock, aka Daredevil, Danny became Daredevil for a while. It doesn't happen in here, but I thought it was an interesting fact. For Colleen Wing, as I said, she was never an Iron Fist or related to one in comics, and also in this version she isn't part of Nightwing Restoration Detective Agency or partner of Misty Knight. Besides that, again, nothing much to say here, and at least nothing that I didn't say in my previous video. For Davos, the main difference between the comics and this season is how he became more prevalent as a character, and how they added the whole becoming New York's protector plot. Otherwise there isn't much to say here. Again, not that I haven't mentioned before in my previous video. Joy is the one character they changed the most, and for the worst if you ask me. I mean, in the original you can't help but feel sympathy for her. How in her eyes her father was just murdered by this Iron Fist person, and that's the reason she wants revenge. Not this mundane and petty reason of being lied to. Honestly, just felt like an overly privileged child throwing a tantrum. For Ward, they basically kept the same story from season 1, mainly a broken man truly wanting to be better but failing at it. Compared to the comics, you can say that besides them sharing names, there is really no similarities between the characters, which isn't exactly bad as his character in comics was very one-dimensional. Misty Knight is another character they changed the most. For example, in comics, by the time she meets Danny, she had already lost her arm and had it replaced with a mechanical prosthetic. There is also the fact that she is still part of the police department rather than having her own detective agency, and one of the main differences is how in this version she isn't the main love interest for Danny. They are basically just friends, and I simply don't get why they decided to change this. Besides that, I guess she's mainly the same character, strong sense of justice, and just generally an upstanding person. Those are the only characters worth mentioning for the sake of the comparison. Now for the conclusion. This season is a bit better than the first one, mainly in its fighting scenes. That was one thing that when I originally watched the show didn't bother me at all. But as I rewatch it back to back, it's extremely obvious how they needed to polish it way more in season 1. And in season 2 they did, so good job there. Not to mention that just like in season 1, I think the acting is top notch. That being said, this season is still plagued with bad changes, like Davos not having his half mark for his failed attempt of defeating Chow Lao. How Joy is just a spoiled, immature brat that is incapable of using an ounce of logic for her decision making. How even though Danny didn't really want the power to begin with, he somehow became addicted to it. And worst of all, how Colleen, the one person who was part of a criminal organization and not even willing to fight to help the city without powers, gained the Iron Fist. I mean, honestly, what's the point? The whole idea of the Iron Fist is that each user has to earn it in some way. That's one of the main reasons why I hated when in comics Swordmaster became the Iron Fist. Literally, this version of Colleen is the most unworthy one. And it's not because she wants to help in ways that don't involve violence, but because she clearly is just willing to use any excuse she can to basically do nothing, to do the least amount of effort. Not to mention that them trying to excuse this by making Colleen the descendant of a previous Iron Fist just felt weak. There is a reason the Iron Fist isn't inherited, but earned. Not to mention that they basically push her into this role out of guilt, rather than she doing it for a true sense of duty like this version of the Iron Fist is supposed to do. Basically not making a legit case for why she is worthy of this power. Just wasn't a good decision, and to make matters worse, we know it happened because they wanted an Asian Iron Fist, rather than it being a good decision for the show or a good adaptation of the characters as a whole. Basically, it's the same complaint I had about season 1. They should have just stick to a more accurate adaptation of the comics rather than overcomplicating things. I mean, it wasn't all bad, as I mentioned, but for the story as a whole, for the main characters, it just wasn't as good as it could have been. So I'm still hoping that Disney takes advantage of this show's being recent addition to the MCU to softly reboot at least the show of Iron Fist, so it's more accurate to the comics, and let's just pretend that the show itself was a what if. That way they can keep the cast and they wouldn't need to do some big adjustments to the other shows, so it is not too convoluted. Plus, they could redeem the story and the character of Iron Fist and slash or aka Danny Rand. That simply deserves a second chance. And yeah, that's about it. Hope you enjoyed the video, hope to see your thoughts in the comments, and I hope to see you next time. Goodbye.